addition to that, 15 questions that go on top of that to determine whether or not these students are college ready. It is a voluntary examination, but in the last iteration of the exam, 78% of the students took the English portion, and 75% of those students that were eligible took the math portion. And the results show us that there's a significant difference between what is expected for graduation from California high schools and what the universities expect upon entrance. So that this program is called the Early Assessment Program, and what we've done is we've partnered with the public schools to try to eliminate the need for remediation prior to the completion of their high school degree. In other words, we have a program where students take the graduation exit exam the 11th grade year, and once those results are known and they're shared with the school, the student, and the parents, programs are put in place, including programs that we've developed that are online to assist those students in reaching the remediation levels that would be at a point where they would be ready to do college work. So that this has been a program that we've only had implemented for about 3 years, and we're waiting to see what the long-term results are. But we have noticed, for example, that in the 2007 test, 16% of the students were proficient and college ready in English, and 55% in math. But what we are finding that as those students move forward and become involved in the university, that the number of students coming to us needing remediation in math is 37% versus 46% for English. So that we think it is having an impact as those students move forward through the testing process and then the remedial situation that we put in place.
So let's start with the issue of how unfit is unfit. Mike, let me go right back to you again. When more than half fail a test coming out of the public school systems, are they failing by a little bit? If we were chatting with them, could we spot, why, what education did they get? Is this a very refined thing? Or is it, oh my goodness, we have to go back and redo all the heavy lifting?
One of the things that we put in place when we set up the early assessment program was to analyze what happened when students came to the campus and enrolled in remedial education. So that we tried to figure out how long would it take for students to be remediated before we're ready to do college level work. And what we found was of those individuals that enrolled and completed the program, 96% were college ready at the end of that first year. So that we felt if we could shove that down into between the 11th and 12th grade year, then we would have a lot less remediation necessary at the university level.
Bill, what about when corporate CEOs are together and they're concerned about the quality of the U.S. workforce? What's the size of the gap there to get a good entry-level job in a corporation?
Well, I think, if you look at the world today, you recognize that you can source talent anywhere, right? Talent is global. It's a global commodity. Work can move anywhere. And so you start with that, and then you look at where do you get the people that want to do what the companies do. But I think the thing we get most challenged on is it's really simple stuff. It's an analytical thought process, common sense, good judgment, ability to communicate. Give me good raw material that has some competence and some confidence. And we recognize that as institutions we need to invest in our workforce as well. Not only in getting it prepared to serve our companies, but to make sure we continue to help people keep their skills renewed. Because, and there's a few of us up here who've been lifers in our professions, and today the average person will have 10 jobs. And so the renewal challenge is incredibly important. But I think we're just looking for the raw material, and for people that want to, all the content of work has become more analytical. And how you get those critical thinking skills into people is essential for business today.
Accenture is all over the world, but you're deeply in India. Help us understand a little bit of what can you accomplish in India that's very hard to do here in the States?
Well, I think, we hired 58,000 people around the world last year. About 15,000 of those were in India. It's a very interesting environment, right? First of all, we talk about science, engineering, technology, math. That's what they all want to study because it's a means to an end. The end is to get a job and go out there and make something happen. It's very interesting. We also recruit to the parents. As they say in the United States, and you folks would know this better than I do, that only 11% of parents steer their child to a course of study. In India, they all steer their child to a course of study. And in fact, we recruit to the parents in 6 weeks and 6 months after they start. Now this is, so they've been through college and now they've joined the company. The parents want a report card. They want to know. So if you think about that climate, right, that's a climate of ambition, of motivation, of people seeing the opportunity to do well and wanting to invest in it. And it's infectious, right? So it's very competitive. But at the end of the day, when you go there, you get great talent, pound for pound. There's some things you need to do like anywhere else. China is very much the same. You know, a language issue, but other than that, a cultural thing that's the same. And so if you're a CEO and your job is to increase shareholder value and compete not against the traditional competitors, but against the competitors that are the emerging market multinationals, the next generation of competitors with names that none of us have ever heard. Those are the people we have to compete against. That's the workforce they use to compete. And I think it just raises the bar and raises the standard for what we need here in the United States in order to be able to have the people that it takes to differentiate and win. And at the end of the day, you know, that's what it's all about.
If you were talking to a half dozen fellow CEOs over drinks one evening and the conversation's expansive, and you begin to talk about what keeps you awake at night, would this group of individuals focus on the U.S. workforce, or would that be a 10th or 20th order?
I would say that they would all focus on attracting and retaining talent. They would think about that globally, though. And because what they would think about is the competitiveness of their workforce. When they think about the United States, they think about the country's competitiveness, which is a combination of educated workforce, trade policies, a series of things, healthcare issues, right? All that go into having a competitive workforce in the U.S. So education's a big part of that, but there are other things that are part of it as well. And we tend to think of talent, at least for the world's 2,000 biggest companies, we tend to think of talent globally now.
You all go to international conferences and you have peers and colleagues around the world. What's the general global view of U.S. secondary education? Or do people just not have a view?
I know just two or three specifics. In China last year, in conversations with their leaders, their statement to us was that we feel at this point that our youngsters are just as well grounded as American students in the content areas. I've gotten similar comments from other countries, leaders in other countries. So they feel that they have at least leveled the content knowledge that our students are gathering. Not just at minimum levels, but they feel like now they're beginning to be competitive at the higher ed level. Not there yet, but aggressive actions to get there at higher ed. But they always raise this issue about what do you do in the United States to develop this sense of innovation, of creativity. They're trying desperately to figure out what's going on in this country in our education system to help them revamp, revise, and develop their programs so that they achieve the same results. I think the irony of all that is that it is probably a mixture of the education system compiled with a number of other factors in a democratic society that's leading to those kinds of results and the kinds of interactions we have with children as they grow up, as opposed to the interactions that are held in other countries. They haven't figured that out yet. It will create an interesting dilemma for them when they have to make some decisions about their forms of government in the future. But they're pretty confident right now that they're achieving the same levels of academic rigor that we are in the elementary and secondary area.
And the trajectory is not a good one.
It is not, and they're devoting tremendous resources in all these countries to reach what America has reached, and they always present it in that way. We've been a shining light to them historically, and their goal is to do as well and surpass the United States, and they're putting resources into the system. They're thinking systematically about how the components come together in coherent ways. They're making investments in various areas of reform with dramatic results.
Vicki, what are you seeing?
Same thing, and what we see, as Bill alluded to, is a level of clarity and transparency about expectations at every level, from how they think about it from a governmental level to how parents think about it, that we do not have in this country. We're still struggling with uniform graduation rates, uniform definitions of what does make for college ready, what really moves students successfully into the workforce or post-secondary opportunities. They have a level of clarity about that we do not have. And I was astonished about a year ago to go to a conference where, they showed a 4x4 grid and really showed the United States in a very poor place from their perspective in that. And it's one thing for us to say that. It's very startling when you're in an international conference and you have that really put in front of you in as stark a ways as they can display it.
When do you think the view of the United States began to tilt? Is this 20 years happening, last 5 years?
Tilt in terms of?
To be less impressed, less deferential to the quality of the U.S. school system, secondary school system.
No, I don't know that it's that we've tilted and we're less differential and we're backing down as much as we're not keeping pace. I mean, it is I don't think it's so much intentional as it is we just have not put our heads up in the way that some speakers talked about this morning, that we should have been putting our heads up and paying attention to this, that we're fairly complacent when it comes to education in this country because we have been such a force for so long and we dedicated ourselves for so much of our history. And we haven't sort of put our head back up and said, oops, we're slipping and we need to rededicate ourselves in some important ways.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's two things. There's education, and then there's the special sauce, which you were talking about. We still have the special sauce. People look here, they can't figure it out how we do what we do, given some of the statistical things. The challenge is the education, continues to go down in the tank, and so the special sauce is the thing that carries us through, the innovativeness, right, the sort of American spirit, and there were some panelists that talked this morning about the culture of the United States, right, and that sort of first-generation college graduate entrepreneur, I can make it sort of thing. We still have a lot of that serves us well. But when you look at these other countries, they'll always struggle with the special sauce. But when China decides to pull off the Olympics, they do it. When China decides they want to have a Formula One race in the country, right, in a year they have a track and 270,000 seats, and they have the last Formula One race of the year. And when they decide they want to raise the bar on education, they do it institutionally across every nook and cranny. And those are the countries that we're competing against. And so we need to keep our special sauce rich and differentiated, but we need to get the water table back up in the tank on the education agenda so people are prepared.
Gene, did you want to say something here?
Just that it seems to me that as we talk with these other countries, there still is a sense that the United States is an admirable place, that we do have a society that is to be admired. We still are a magnet for those intellectual minds. But they are quickly realizing that that's a historic definition of the country, and that we're noticing it in terms of students who come from other countries to take advantage of higher education opportunity. They used to stay here, and we're seeing more and more of them now being pulled back into their home countries because of the tremendous commitment that's being made to those countries to build education systems. So on one hand, we're losing a talent pool that we historically had, and on the other hand, they're taking advantage of that talent pool.
And I just want to add one other thing, and that is that I believe that one of the strengths that we have, I think Bill touched on it briefly, but I would like to highlight it, is that I really think that what makes that part of that juice, and a large part of that juice, is the diversity that we have on our campuses, the diversity we have in this country, because we don't look at the problem from the same point of view as we address it. And so that you become aware of alternative ways of thinking about things because of the diverse populations that we interact with on a regular basis.
One closing question on this. I was looking back through the literature, and this complaint, especially by corporate America, about the quality of the gap for the incoming employees, has been around since late 19th century. I don't know if it's as acutely felt as it is now. Now you have the opportunity, I know a better way to phrase it. How much of what was talked about this morning as education fatigue has set in the corporate sector? Do you see people just saying, the hell with it, let's just go overseas and do our staffing over there? Or do you think there's a sort of recommitting to the whole education involvement?
Well, I think there's both. I think there is fatigue on the big agenda, right? I mean, you know, if you take the Business Roundtable, we are real advocates of No Child Left Behind. You can decide what you think about that or not, but we think it's incredibly important. But you just, like, you run out of gas, right, in terms of, like, trying to follow the legislation and trying to figure out reauthorization and trying to figure out what, you know, who's going to negotiate what changes to it. When, you know, we looked at it as a means to an end, not the only thing, but an important thing in getting a better outcome. And yet the attention of business people is short, right? They've got, you know, 20 problems to deal with. This is one of them. And if it's not going to move on or it's outside of our control, we'll deal with the things that are in our control. Well, what is in our control, I think, are two things. One is certainly being able to source talent all around the globe. And that's just a competitive dynamic that's here to stay. The second one, you know, gets back to more the connection you can make in your community between the local institution, be they K through 12 or higher education or community colleges I mentioned, in the company. And so how do we do a better job of getting what we need by helping right down where the process is? So how do we get the community college systems to train people to work at Caterpillar or to work at a utility or to work at Accenture or to work at, you know, financial services companies? How do we reach out and do a better job of connecting so we get the talent that we need to do our job? And so I think at that level we're doing an exceptionally good job. On the big institutional level, it gets you get worn out. I think it's a good choice of words.
Let me wrap up this topic. I was remembering when I was putting notes together a talk I heard where the individual was talking about the turn of the last century, the 19th to the 20th century. And he said, by orders of magnitude, the most important academic center in the world was Oxford. And he said the last 100 years have been terribly damning for Oxford. Now it's barely relevant anywhere. I know nobody's that apocalyptic here, but it is interesting to see in 20 years how much reputational decline or self-confidence compromise has taken place on this set of issues. Let's go to the happier issue, national standards and testing. So everyone has this issue framed up already. Each state is allowed to set its own standards for proficiency and to do its own testing. So you end up with wildly variant definitions of proficient. In Tennessee, 88% of the students pass the state exam, but then when given the federal exam, only 27% pass. Same sort of thing for Oklahoma, 86 pass the state exam, 26% pass the federal exam. And there are schools now that are getting awards from the state governments for their high performance that under federal guidelines are targeted for closure. It looked to me like there was enormous enthusiasm for this topic of national standards 2-3 years ago, and it felt like there's a little more concern about whether that could happen now. What's your sort of state of the union on this issue? Where is the country going on national standards? Are we pulling back from it, or are we still moving forward?
I'd just pick up on it initially. I think that my definition of the first round to address this would have been federal standards as opposed to national standards. And it began with the Clinton administration, heavy effort beginning with assessment as well as conversations around national goals. There was a tremendous reaction to that, and I think the politicians, because of that negative reaction, pull back a bit. But I think at this point there is an alternative, and Roy Romer sort of put that on the table this morning, and that is that we need to get by this debate about whether it's federal or state or locally developed standards. We do need common standards in this country. It is unacceptable for us to have all those differences. The public doesn't understand it. We're not giving the guidance to teachers and to administrators or to students and their parents if we avoid this issue. There is a movement, and I would recognize Mike Cohen, who's in this audience somewhere from Achieve, Governor Hunt, and some others who had begun this national conversation with us a few years ago. The states have now decided that we're going to move toward a set of common standards, common core standards across the United States. Version 1.0 of that came out a month or so ago with 16 states who've gone through the process and have identified a common core in math and in English language arts. We have plans for science. But there are 34 states now who are engaged in a process of identifying this common core. When I say common core, I want to get back to a couple points that were mentioned. It's not sufficient to identify a common core that is of low expectations. So we want higher expectations than have been stated by most states in the country at this point. A few states have very high standards that are competitive standards, but not all. You referenced some that were not. Secondly, those standards need to be put in a form that people understand, both the business community and higher education, and they need to be fewer than what we've had in the past. So we are now defining in that common core, with the work of the chief and the governors and the council, a set of standards that are college and work ready. Why? Because now we can define very little difference between what it takes to get into a challenging career than it does to get into college. That separation between college kids and other kids needs to be eliminated, and so that's what we're doing with the standards. Every youngster needs to be working toward high standards. They can be identified through a process of asking business and asking higher education what those success factors are. Secondly, it's not sufficient to do this within this country and measure one state against another state. They have to be internationally benchmarked. And so we're beginning that work now of benchmarking our work against the work in Asian countries, and then we'll move to the European countries. And then finally, we have to look at, and we have to state these standards in a form around student performance. It's not enough to just list a set of content areas that will be addressed. We've got to say what students will do with that content and be specific enough about that then we can begin to measure it in more robust ways than we have right now. So my point is that states have committed to this. We've had a good 18 months of interaction among us. We're coming together around these standards. You're going to see a movement now that is different than what came around in the first round. That is a closely defined group of people identified by some form of federal government, identifying the individuals and then dictating a process. This process of engagement is coming up from the states with a heavy level of engagement of a number of different organizations, content organizations, and others who have the expertise in this area.
What do the others here think of this bottom-up strategy for establishing common standards?
So, I heard Governor Pawlenty of Minnesota say not very long ago that America's still the best in the world once inspired. And I think we sometimes forget that our 50 states have actually accomplished quite a lot together when they see the need very clearly to do so. And this is one instance where I think those states are seeing the need to do this, and not only having the conversation about fewer, clearer, higher standards with more uniformity across a common set, but also having similar conversations around how do we create a better assessment system aligned to those? How do we think about data in alignment with that? How do we really give teachers and students information on what works? And thinking about those standards, as I said earlier, about the through line to get to all of those things. And there were a lot of states in the room last week at an Achieve meeting having that very conversation. I think the momentum is there, and we're certainly going to do everything we can to help support that effort.
So, Vicki, if you had to place a bet on some activity to produce common standards around the country, would you bet on this bottoms-up approach?
Well, I'm not saying, I think, earlier we had the conversation about can we get to it through Plan A or Plan B, and I think Plan B is just as viable, actually. And I've seen incredible momentum over the last year, and I think we are very optimistic about what we're seeing and the potential of that. And I think, again, we talked about, we have proof points all over the country this morning, the fact that we have 16 states that have already done that a number of those states are lining up on some common assessments. I mean, that's, I think that is a good sign that we could actually accomplish this. And I think we have history in the standards. The very first 1.0 version of standards a few years ago started with a smaller handful of states, and after a relatively short period of time for this country, 50 states had good standards. Hopefully we can replicate that.
Explain the politics of the original effort at federal standards. What happened? When did that happen? What happened? How over is it?
How over is it? I think it's pretty over. I think it came out of the frustration that you mentioned early on, and that is, although not quite as well known as it is now, the great disparity among the states in terms of expectations, and the frustration that something needed to be done, the large cry coming from the business community and from citizens to do something about this. There was an attempt in the Clinton administration to try to come forward with a coordinated effort. I think the pushback, frankly, was that it was an idea probably before its time. There was a tremendous resistance to this federalization of education in this country, which still exists, and it was very different than anything that we had done in education, except in about 8 to 10 states. And literally, that was an effort to build on the work that some of the innovative states had taken on in the late 80s and early 90s. An effort that I think still probably will have a lot of resistance and concern if it were attempted again.
If this is the largest effort going on, describe the movement. Who's doing it? How many people? Who's funding it? If people, this is largely a reform audience. If people wanted to be a part of it, who's animating the front of it?
Well, the organizations I mentioned earlier were doing the technical work is Achieve Inc., which is a work being done under the American Diploma Project. Achieve Inc., for those of you who do not know, is an organization comprised of a board of governors and business officials who guide the direction of that organization. And Mike Cohen and his staff are now working with the states. And when I say working with the states, this is not a process of going into a state and asking them to adopt a set of standards that have been pre-identified. They did identify from an extensive effort with the business community and with higher education their definitions of proficiency, success, and out of that. And that's important. If you look back at the United States over the last few years, we really have not attempted to set standards against an outcome measure. And this is the first time we've done that. We have done it through a sort of a consensus process of bringing people together who are in K-12, but we pretty well eliminated the people who are receiving our students from that conversation. This was turning that upside down. What do these businesses say it will take to be successful? What does higher ed say it will take to be successful? Use that as a benchmark against the standards you have. Try and go through a very detailed and I was a chief in a state when we did this. It's a very painful process of bringing the community together to try to resolve these issues. But it is important that everyone sits around that table. But the goal here is not to take the views of everyone in that community and come up with a set of standards that becomes so extensive, I would call it the unteachable curriculum in our schools today. You literally cannot teach what most states are saying is important for them to know. We have not differentiated, so putting this criteria against it is important. And it's a highly engaged process within each state. This year, they're expanding that work in terms of benchmarking against colleges and university expectations and business expectations to international expectations as they work with the states of California, Illinois, Florida, and Texas. And this work continues to evolve. I'm not sure we'll ever be at a point where we'll say these are the standards that are going to be static for now until into the future. The states, on the other hand, are going to have some sort of continuity for measurement as we move ahead. But I expect the states within their own context and within their own schedule of work will have to continually upgrade these as we learn from the work of the other states.
Yeah, I would just add, back to the fatigue of business, I mean, this standards discussion, the average life expectancy of a CEO of a business roundtable company is 3.6 years. I mean, we don't have a lot of time to chit-chat about standards. Like, we got to come in, get the job, get the thing right, raise the performance, or somebody comes and takes you away and gets another guy. So when you talk about patience, or you talk about getting worn out by the process, this standards is one that I think the business community struggles with, because the world we live in is about metrics and standards and measures and outcomes. That's what we solve for every single day of the week. And we don't have time to have a debate about it, right? We have to set the bar, and if we don't set the bar gets set by our competitors, right? And it's just not that hard. And at the end of the day, you only have so much time, or you fail. And when you fail, they get somebody else to see if they can do it. And I think this is an area where the business community gets particularly frustrated that, like, I know it's hard to get institutional momentum around all this with everyone having a say, but this is the thing the other guys, and I mean the other countries, do exceptionally well. And whether it's in the healthcare system or the education system or other things, there's something about this sense of urgency, this call to arms, and the ability to lose the egos and the agendas and get something that gets us headed in the right direction is absolutely essential in the minds of business people.
It's interesting too that I could see a similar set of pattern emerging at the state level. Governors come and go; they have that same sense of urgency. In the last year, we've lost 14 chief state school officers out of this. So it is a very intense environment. And I think the sooner we get this behind us in terms of a set agenda that we can pursue, the better we're going to be as a country. Because as hard as this is just the beginning work. As Vicki said in her opening comment, there are so many other aspects about this that need to be addressed. And as long as this is unresolved, it's going to be noise in the education community. It's going to cause us it will divert our attention from some other very important issues.
I was just going to say that in working with the business community, I hear frequently we think in terms of quarters and you think in terms of decades.
So if each of you could, for a moment, have a magic wand and you could get one thing, one desire for education reform. So it could be school choice or teacher training or class size. One of the choices was having common standards and tests. How high up the list of the reforms would you want for that magic moment?
For me, it would be right at the top. Unless you know where you're going, you're not going to know whether you get there or not. And I would combine that with data systems. I noticed Secretary's here, and she and we in the states in the last year have joined in combined efforts to increase the data capacity of the states, but putting together the expectations with a clear set of indicators against those and assessment systems with the data system to collect, report, and use those data, it would be right at the top of my agenda.
I would agree. I think there's nothing more impactful than what happens, as I said earlier, between kids and teachers in the classroom, and you can't make that the most powerful or lead it to be college ready and not have remediation and other things going on if you aren't really clear about what it is we want from standards that have the kind of data systems that tells us if we're getting there, and be able to think about the kind of curriculum and student supports and other tools that teachers and kids need to be successful.
And I think that goes all the way up. I think in many places across the United States, particularly those institutions that are nostalgic and ASCU have really taken on the recommendation of Secretary Spellings and developed the voluntary assessment system and are participating in that to try to show some that the institutions of higher education are also attempting to measure what they're doing and do it so that other people know what we're doing.
I guess I would just leave it with you professionals to decide what's at the top of the list. I guess I would tell you this. To represent one company of many, the 160 in the Business Roundtable that hire hundreds of thousands of people a year, we got good kids. I mean, there is great, whether it's genetic or secret sauce or whatever it is, in the system, we got great talent, right? Winning talent, competitive talent. Right? We got to get past this point so we can get them up where we can see them and we can get them infused with what they need in order to be competitive and productive in the society that we live in today. And so I appreciate all you professionals who know how to do this, because it is essential for the health of our companies and at the end of the day our country that we do this and that we do it in short order.
Let's open it up for questions, if we may. There's somebody who's assigned to have collected the view of the audience, so she or he's welcome to go first, but why don't we make sure anyone who wants to ask a question can do so. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is basically this, and I'm somebody who supports some form of national, not federal standards, and there seems to be a pretty strong consensus here that 50 different sets of standards are not very sensible. But my question is, do the states have the political will to operationalize higher standards for all children? And I ask that question based on some of us, in our experience with No Child Left Behind, where we have 50 different sets of standards, and we have many states kind of racing to the bottom. Secretary Spelling spoke recently at the Business Roundtable, and she observed, and many of us on the outside have observed, that states have been gaming the system, trying to make their schools look better than they really are, in the process excluding important groups of kids from calculations of school achievement, like students with limited English and students with disabilities. Given the track record of the states to date, and I would suggest that it has not been good when it comes to equity, and it has not been good when it comes to putting into place policies that enable all children to reach the standards they put in place. What really are the prospects for states actually being able to effectuate achievement of these standards in some reasonable period of time, assuming that they go forward the way many of you have suggested they ought to go forward?
Well, I would say it's the best bet we have right now. If you look at the other alternatives on the table, I see them as having either a poor history or being in their infancy. We have the laboratory that has been established. We have a number of states that are moving toward it. Whether they'll be able to sustain this in an era of high-stakes reform really depends on the voices that come forward. A lot of the decisions that are made in states are really not the decision of educators. They're the political response to a number of voices that are being brought forward. If a collective body within a state comes forward and says, we don't believe that we should have high standards, we believe our students are learning at levels that they should be learning, and we're pleased with where it's taking us, my sense is that's where the state's going to end up. That's why I hope you're not too tired, because I think the voice of business is critical in all this. We need those other leveling voices out there to protect us as we go through this process. It is political, and there will be all kinds of forces to hold back. But the imperative is so great. I don't know how a reasonable person thinking about this, if they're fully aware of the stake, will back away from this. And I think the strongest allies are the consumers. The folks in higher education and in business and industry have to step forward and say this is the right direction and support the effort. And I think parents are a tremendous ally here, and who have not been a part of the conversation and whom we have to target in the next few years.
Vicki, what's your confidence level?
So I think there are a variety of ways to go about it, as Jean said, and that states will take different paths. And the good news is that the coalition that's forming is being very thoughtful about the kind of technical assistance for states who may want additional support and help. And governors and chief state school officers are thinking about what's the pathway. For example, in Pennsylvania, we had a strong set of standards, but we had not been clear enough about how good is good enough or which ones were the highest priority for college ready. So with under Governor Rendell and as his state secretary, it gave me an opportunity to think about how do you prioritize those, how do you then create the assessment system and align with that so that you essentially took the mystery out of the standards and the assessments and set new performance bars. That was a way for us to go about it in Pennsylvania. Other states will have different ways, whether they simply a matter of prioritizing, whether they are at a place with their standards where they need to recraft those. But I think the states, from the conversations we've had and watching this coalition, an overwhelming majority of states are really serious about this effort and I think committed to it and do understand the urgency. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this is possible.
Another question?
On this side. If I may, I'm Suzanne Tashney, and I was once on the California State Board of Education, was the partner when CSU did the early placement test, and I'm always so grateful to hear you reference us every time CSU talks about that, because CSU did really most of the heavy lifting on that effort. But under the rubric of urgency to act, I think that initiative is an example of how to get things done sooner than the decade, within the quarter system. What happened there is the chancellor of CSU, Charlie Reed, got sick of the committees that were meeting and trying to figure out how all the university systems together in California could create this test, and he said, we're just going to do it for CSU, which took the sweet spot of students, because that's the state college system and that's the kids who were really struggling most with remediation. So the courage on the part of the state board was simply to say, yes, good idea, let's go. They sent their 3 guys to a room, we sent our 3 guys to a room, and we all looked at the standards together. And when the gentleman said 15 questions, that was really the problem in alignment, was 15 questions on the test. What didn't happen is 10 years of consensus building committees to get all the stakeholders involved. Charlie decided to do it, we sold it, and it was a year, is that right? And fill me in on the details because I'm forgetting too, it's been a while. But the process there is a benchmark to study. And I think it falls more under Plan A than Plan B in terms of the way we were talking about national standards, but it moved really fast, and it was an example of the problem is most often just the decision to act as opposed to trying to build consensus to buffer our decision to act.
Please.
My name's Tom Luce, and I'm with the National Math and Science Initiative. And along the topic of a sense of urgency, how do we square the circle with, and I'm all for raising standards, we're not competitive internationally, but in the meantime, we have hundreds and probably thousands by now of schools that we know are failing with low standards. And what are we going to do about that issue today before we lose another generation of workers that Bill Green needs to hire?
First decision we make is we do not lower our standards to satisfy or guarantee success for those low achievers. I think it's even more imperative that we continue this work on raising standards, but at the same time, it's not enough to just tell those schools that they're not succeeding. We have major capacity issues to literally help those districts and schools turn things around. I think of many of the areas of great need in the states right now, it is this area. How do we help districts build internal capacity to turn around low-performing schools married with a strong intent and set of actions on the part of a state to do something about it? In many cases, this is the one area that we have neglected our responsibility. That is, we have done a fairly good job with those schools that are on the margin, that are sort of cranking along but have similar intent. But in these cases where you have toxic situations, it's going to take a revolutionary kinds of redesign structures. Those children cannot stay in those schools through graduation, and that long-term sort of helping school districts turn around is an inadequate solution to the problem. So I say stay with the standards. Don't let the standards be affected by the low-performing schools, but we've got to think about much more aggressive action and commitment on the part of the states and districts to turn the low performers around, even to the point of these very radical kinds of solutions that are coming forward. Elimination of schools, redesign with new charters and responsibilities, new kinds of management programs and delivery of service, whatever it takes to get those most difficult situations improved and out of our system. There is a disproportionate amount of failure in these very few schools that are weighing down the whole system.
And Gene, I certainly agree with, and I know that you're working hard on that issue. It just seems to me as a sense of urgency, we've got to get behind what are the best practices, and then we must provide the support to people like Nancy Grasmick. I mean, she took on the issue of a school in Baltimore and met an amount of fierce resistance, and it seems to me if we're going to talk of how we support change, we've got to really get behind these radical changes and not write off another generation. And I'm all for raising the standards. Believe me, we are not internationally competitive.
Thank you.
Bob Wise with the Alliance for Excellent Education. Gene, you stand at an interesting intersection because you represent the 50 chief state school officers in all those issues, particularly the one that every state be proficient by 2014, although every state determines what proficiency is. At the same time, you have to relate to the federal government, not only under NCLB, but the standards issue. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what makes the equation different this time than perhaps 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when there were national standards issues. And also under the heading urgent call, what do you see as the role of Congress being in this?
And Bob, before you step aside, I want to thank you for your advocacy on this issue and your role in our partnership in all of this too. But The difference is that we've been about the business of standards-based reform for a number of years, but it really wasn't anchored in before No Child Left Behind. So we've had those years of experience. On one hand, we had a number of states that had led the way in terms of developing standards-based reform, but there were several who were outside the system and not engaged. Now, literally every state. Now, we can talk about the level of those standards, whether they're adequate or not, but currently there is a major shift in the country. We are in a standards-based reform movement. That's not going to go away. And so now the states are thinking much more strategically about the type of standards they have in place, whether they're adequate or not, and what needs to be done to improve them. So I see a very different climate in this country than existed before the first authorization, No Child Left Behind. In terms of the role of Congress, when I say a state-led effort, I don't see this divorced from some action on the part of Congress. These things could be incentivized by the Congress. For example, what if when these standards come to a point of definition and clarity, what if the Congress could say, if a state adopts these standards, we'll give some help to a coalition of states who would come together to develop really strong assessment systems around them? Or what could happen if the federal government began to think about ways to promote this kind of development in other areas of the curriculum as we move ahead? So I can see a very strong partnership with the federal government on this issue.
And just in closing, I agree wholeheartedly, and my sense is that the Congress is looking for somebody that can step forward if there's consensus around an approach just like this. It takes the onus off it being federal, but truly makes it national.
Our panelists have been eager to use these last couple of minutes to, on behalf of their organizations, officially endorse one of the presidential candidates, but we are out of time. I'm going to have to let them off.